Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Maggie Jackson, who is a journalist and author, and most recently, the author of this book here is called Uncertain, The Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure, which was preceded by a couple other books. This one's called Distracted, The Erosion of Attention and the Coming Dark Age. And before that, even this one called What's Happening to Home, Balancing Work Life and Refuge in the Information Age. Welcome, Maggie.
Thank you very much. And the Distracted book has a second edition, 2018, which strangely enough has a different subtitle. But in any case, there is a 2018 fully updated edition out there. Just throw that out.
Well, because I was going to say, this book, I went back to it and revisited it, and it's from 2008. And I couldn't believe it because in many ways it was so prophetic, right? I mean, this was only 1 year after the smartphone, right? And already I think you were starting to raise alarms about the decline in people's capacity for managing their attention, I guess. And, later, of course, in the Uncertain book, you talk about the importance of daydreaming and mind wandering. And I think a lot of people might confuse the two, right? They might think that, mind wandering and distraction are the same thing, right? But they're clearly very, very different. Maybe before we jump into uncertainty, you can speak to that, right? Because it seems like a lot of the language around attention, we're still trying to grapple with these different concepts.
Right. And uncertainty and distraction/attention, these are concepts that live on a spectrum, that exist on a spectrum, and that also can be very subjective. So your distraction could be my very important point of focus, and my bit of uncertainty could be very productive, and someone else's uncertainty can be a sinkhole. So I'm trying in both of these books to basically define, add structure, add framework so that people can, utilize their attention, utilize this unwieldy, messy concept of uncertainty in unexpected ways. But just to go back to that granular point, I don't use the word mind wandering, the term mind wandering in Uncertain for deliberate reasons. I use the words creative reverie and daydreaming because one of the points of that chapter is that very often when the mind wanders, the executive networks of the brain are active, which puzzled scientists for a long time. The thought, to put it simply, is that the mind is achieving a kind of coherence when we're daydreaming in creative ways or in planful ways or just in ways that are useful and add to our mental well-being. So you can mind wander, your mind can wander, your mind can, be abducted in some ways by itself. That's a little bit of a strange concept, but in any case, we all know what that means. But I think that the daydreaming that I write about is not a negative distraction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the main point of Uncertain, the book, is that the capacity to maintain a state of uncertainty is a very valuable skill, but it's one which requires, continuous maintenance because is this tendency, this pressure, this instinct, this drive to seek out, right, epistemic certainty. And so maybe we could talk about why is it that we like states of certainty? Why is it that there's something inherently uncomfortable about not knowing, about, suspending one's conclusions?
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start. I mean, essentially, in brief, we evolved, or any organism really, for its survival needs and wants answers. So the in-between space, the place without the answer yet, is a place of discomfort. In essence, it's a sort of driver of our, of our willingness and our ability to resolve problems. I mean, if I'm in the forest, I need to know if that fruit is delicious or poisonous? I need to know. That's okay. That, disliking uncertainty is a provocation. But it's when we slide into, I think, as we can see today, and as evidence shows, a kind of allergy to, states of not knowing, to, that emphasis on neat, pat, instant answers. That's where we're being counterproductive or not utilizing well this phenomenal gift we have of being unsure. And I think it's also important to add that, uncertainty is just to add to that idea of discomfort, because that's where people really start. I do a lot of talks now on uncertainty, and even around the world, and I often poll audiences to ask people what's the one word that comes to mind when I say uncertainty. Invariably, I have to say, I've done this dozens and dozens of times, if not 100, and the first word is anxiety. It's followed by fear and doubt. 75% of these few words that I, accumulate are negative. And that's really indicative of how we dislike it. But at the same time, it's what's really important to understand, and comes from the new neuroscience of uncertainty, is that this discomfort we feel is actually good stress. So when you're meeting up with something new or unexpected or ambiguous in the forest or in the workplace or wherever, you actually, have a stress response. Neurotransmitters, hormones, et cetera, are cascading through your body and brain are kind of springing into action. And what's really amazing and very new scientifically is that your brain on uncertainty is undergoing remarkably positive changes. So when you're unsure, this has been documented in emergency room physicians and others. When you're unsure, your working memory improves, your attention heightens, your brain becomes more receptive to new data. So this is a state, yes, that's uncomfortable, but that's good stress. You're actually being primed to learn and perform. One neuroscientist told me it's a signal. The brain is telling itself, uncertainty is the brain telling itself there's something to be learned here. So that puts a different spin on this idea that we should retreat from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think stress continues to have a bad name, right? In the general public, and it still hasn't come to the realization that stress could be good or bad. I mean, there's this, Yerkes-Dodson law where there's an optimal amount of stress, but I think it's also it's perspectival, right? So I think you point out that if you have an attitude which views stress as good as opposed to being bad, then you're much more likely to kind of leverage the benefits of this type of arousal.
Yeah, exactly. And there are studies, Jeremy Jameson at University of Rochester has done exactly that with students who are about to take a law exam or high schoolers who are afraid of math. When they are just told that stress can be positive, stress is helping them to perform, then they actually do well. They see it as performance mode rather than fear mode. And it's really true also that your physiological and cognitive response or reaction is different when you're fearful than when you're uncertain. And when you're fearful, yes, you might be revving up and you might have some stress symptoms like sweating, etc., heart racing, but in that moment of fear, you're actually shutting down the higher order cognition in your brain. So you're going to survival mode, and blood is actually shutting away from your brain when you're fearful. So that distinction really helps people to understand, I'm unsure, I'm uncomfortable. That's important. I remember doing research about actually for Distracted. It was about where does focus lend itself in the process of research, and of course confusion, and it really plays an important role in the process of be doing good research. And Carol Coltow, this incredible, like a rock star in the library world, has done research on this, and that idea that research is frustrating, that research is confusing before you find focus was so helpful to me, because I suddenly realized, oh, I'm not stupid because I don't get this immediately. There's a process here, and it involves frustration, stress, and also confusion, i.e. uncertainty. And when you know that, then you can harness it rather than backing away from it and retreating from it, and which leads to a very, very poor ability to perceive and contend with the world. Truly, I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like athletes understand this to some degree, right? They know that they have to, rev things up, and they embrace these challenges. But for some reason, when it comes to intellectual inquiry, people don't. They don't understand this. I mean, I had a professor in grad school who used to say, confusion is 90% of the way to wisdom, right? And I thought, wow, I love this. So I've been recycling that ever since. But when I tell my students that, it's usually the first time they've heard this, right? It was certainly the first time I heard it, but it immediately resonated with me. It doesn't seem to resonate with my students as much.
Well, I think you're raising a good point, or a good point comes to mind when I hear you say that, because another factor in our attitude, a stance, approach to uncertainty today is, well, first of all, our individual tolerance for it. That's a personality trait. We can talk about that. But second of all, the external cultural messages that we get. So, even the science, educational science has not picked up on the positive role of confusion in learning, or what someone calls desirable difficulties, until recently. So, and then the message that we get from society, from the pundit on the TV, or even the way teachers teach, which is to interrupt, not let silence happen, not have pauses. We can just go through everybody knows this landscape of our day, rush, rush, rush. I usually, before I wrote this book, would stack meetings and even stack my scientific reading and bing, 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 turn to this, and that left no time for uncertainty and all it offers us. So I think that the students are getting these tremendous messages. If it's not quick and it's not neat, and then, of course, I haven't even mentioned two things. One, hundreds of years of emphasis in Western society on efficiency and speed, and even to the extent that the rationalist intelligence, the supreme form of intelligence, is, just pursuing a goal at all costs, A to B. That's what works. That's what we hear. And then finally, the rationalist view of intelligence is the foundation for not just AI, but for technology. So we get, aesthetically and in temporal and spatial terms, we get these, incredible devices that, for all their wonders, offer us that same message again and again. Neat, pet, instant. Neat, pet, instant. And it's a really kind of a vicious cycle and cultural atmosphere for discovering these other elements of human life. But yet it's really important if we're going to be thriving in a time of flux.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Most people, when someone admits to uncertainty, they're perceived as weak or incompetent, right? So, I mean, remember Harry Truman said, "Give me a one-handed economist," right? I don't want to hear, all the different trade-offs. But it's true. If you have a broker, I teach a course called Behavioral Finance, and we talk about how, if you're a financial advisor and you say like, "Hey, I don't know," then you lose clients, right? And if you're a management consultant and you say, well, I don't really know, then you lose business, right? So there's this reward function in the world where you are rewarded for demonstrating confidence and certainty. And so I like to joke about both my MBAs and AI, always certain, sometimes right.
Right, exactly. Well, and I think that that's very important, and part of the reason why that system, I call it that, cultural system stands, is because the science hasn't been there to prove us wrong, to dig into the nuance. There's beginning to be a lot of science about communicating uncertainty, for instance. So I talk to leaders all the time about this, and I will say, and the evidence now shows that yes, if the doctor walks in and says, "Well, you have cancer," but I don't know, and leaves, of course, you're left hanging in a negative way. That's not useful. But studies from on communications and persuasion, and then even studies of teaching uncertainty to young doctors, et cetera, show that your communications of uncertainty, your expressions of uncertainty matter, and then they can be sophisticated and nuanced. So, for instance, a doctor or a leader who connects uncertainty, an expression of uncertainty, with potential. I don't know, the doctor might say, but I'm going to consult two different experts in the field, and we're going to gather our resources and find out more. It's still clear that person is not saying, and I have the exact answer and I know it immediately, etc., which is still venerated, I must say. But at the same time, there are sophisticated, skilled ways to express uncertainty. And one of the other things that's really exciting is, those little words called hedge words. I call it maybe power. So many different studies have shown that using the word maybe, which many people think is weak in a leader in public, is actually related to conversational receptiveness. In other words, when you use words like maybe, sometimes, could be, etc., you don't look weak. Studies show this, but you're signaling you're receptive to others' points of view, and you're also signaling linguistically that there's something more to know. And wow, what a great, opening expanse, and how useful is that in this day and age of complex problems that we're facing. So don't be afraid of maybe.
Yeah. Now, you talk also about how expertise can sometimes lead to the accumulation of blind spots in a way, right? You talk about the Einstellung effect. And you talk about how kids can see solutions sometimes that adults, can't see. I oftentimes do this very well-known experiment with executives, right, where they have to build a tower, and then I highlight to them that kids do a much better job of it than executives and MBAs, right, because they just kind of fixate on a solution and then try to execute on it, and so I mean, obviously there's some kind of trade-off, right? We want expertise, but we also want them to be kind of conscious of their blind spots. How do you navigate that trade-off? I mean, is there a win-win? Is there a way that you can, have an awareness of your blind spots without it necessarily detracting from your expertise?
Yes, there absolutely is. And I think it's really important to distinguish between routine expertise, so-called routine expertise. That's the heuristic, shortcut thinking based on honed knowledge. The doctor coming into the room, diagnosing chickenpox across the room. That's great. There's an answer there. As researchers say, this is a benign environment. In other words, it's predictable. The answer does lie in the rule book, and they spotted it because they practiced, and they have mental models that allow them to recognize that solution, and then recognize that situation, that predicament, and then apply the solutions that worked in the past. But that's the kind of model of expertise that we've put on the pedestal. The guy who walks into the room knowing just what to do all the time. This breaks down when people are in new, unpredictable situations. That's where the error, the shadow side of knowing occurs. Because over time, and I've read studies in so many different disciplines, from physics to finance to et cetera, leadership, over time, experts across all kinds of walks of life begin to fall into what's called carryover mode. And that's the carrying over those old solutions even to ill-fitting problems. And what's really important is, uncertainty is that bridge between your old knowledge and forging new knowledge. And it's also important to underline that this doesn't have to take all day. I was embedded in in operating rooms in Toronto, and I saw a dramatic near miss based on a senior surgeon speeding through an operation, treating it was like it was all routine. This is a liver operation. It's renowned as an organ for being very difficult to maneuver through, to navigate. He was just resting on his old knowledge when he should have been at the height of the difficult crux of the situation, slowing down, pausing, kind of gathering his uncertainty. And there are 3 steps that you can do. You need to inhabit the question, i.e., slow down. And then you second need to widen and deepen your frameworks of understanding. We all hear quite a bit about widening the frameworks of understanding, examining multiple options for what's gone wrong. Not very many people do it, but we've heard that. But deepening means testing and evaluating. So this is what adaptive experts do. They not only in the moment, utilize their uncertainty, their beginner's mind, as you might call it, but they also over time tend to approach their careers in a very different way. They take on harder cases. They revel in mistakes, or at least welcome the learning opportunities. This is a very, very, very hard way to be. And yet these are the people who are constantly working at the edge of their knowledge, they're not just applying their knowledge, they're expanding their knowledge. And so that's the kind of expert we need to kind of venerate in a society. And I think we're kind of moving there because there's been so much debate about expertise. And it's all to do with skillful uncertainty.
So I mean, a lot of it is you're basically overfitting on your training data, so to speak, right? So, when you have an out of sample new incident, you fail to recognize that the rule or the algorithm you developed on the old data, it doesn't apply, right? And so, I mean, are there ways to remedy this? I mean, one way is socially, right? So inject an amateur into the equation, right? And give them some voice, or, have someone who has a very different background. I mean, you talk about diversity, of course, in decision making, but I mean, is there a role for amateurs here? I think I did a previous podcast where they talked about how the interns are being squeezed out because they are slowing things down, right? So the efficiency of the surgeries, for instance, are impaired when you have someone in there kind of asking questions and but does it help to have amateurs in the room?
Yeah, I think people cross knowledge, teams are very important because that's one way in which the supreme expert, the person who's taken as the senior, most experienced person, can be questioned. Another thing that is really important, and this is a kind of different but related topic, highly related topic, is to foster dissent, but allow for airing of differences, allow people not just to speak up. I think that concept of psychological safety has grave limits because it just lends itself to people cultivating comfort, and comfort and agreement undermine a group very quickly.
Well, not to be fair, that's not Amy Edmondson's original, meaning of psychological safety. It's been hijacked to mean that. It should be very
exactly. No, I give her great credit for all her brilliance, and that was not against that. I don't like to talk about the comfort, being comfortable with uncertainty, because actually one of the markers of being highly, skillful at uncertainty is that you see it as a challenge, not a threat. Challenge, not a picnic. So going back to the dissent question, it's interesting because years and years of research shows that a dissenting voice, or a kind of argument in the team, or some kind of airing differences works, bolsters collaboration, bolsters creativity, bolsters accuracy in a group, even if the dissenting voice or the disagreeing side is wrong. And what does that mean? Well, that means it's the collective uncertainty that's sparked that allows people to literally, the studies show, kind of be, pushed into a new collective mindset. They become more questioning, more skeptical, and then the good benefits flow. So that's really important. Uncertainty is something that you need to foster in that group situation. And we as experts, as adaptive experts, can, have that willingness, have that stance, be willing to work at the edge, utilize these markers of adaptive expertise, practice adaptive expertise. But when we're in a group situation, which we often are, we need to help one another by having those dissenting voices. It fits in together.
Right. So you have to resist the desire for group cohesion, right? So group cohesion has value, right? But it can sometimes overwhelm the discovery process.
Yes, there's a very big gold standard longitudinal study of climbers on Mount Everest. They studied climbing teams. I think people out of Stanford, actually, researchers out of Stanford, studied climbing teams that were highly diverse, especially in knowledge and in other ways. They found if the team was ascending or descending the mountain and they emphasized an all-for-one mentality, group-first mentality, they were far more likely to suffer the death of a climber. And it's very serious. And so it's agreement, I call it the opiate of the group. It makes us kind of complacent because it feels good. I mean, certainty and answers feel good. Speedy, fluent, and fluency is one of those cognitive states that make us smile, as Daniel Kahneman says in Thinking Fast and Slow. It is challenging. It's uncomfortable, and yet the rewards are so much greater when we can, welcome this uncertainty and know how to handle it.
Yeah, I sometimes say in my classes, the dumber the question, the better. Right? I give out the dumb question award sometimes. But I mean, sometimes you don't have other people to do this. And so I think, baking it into your own way of thinking, where you kind of go back to first principles every now and then. I think you said something like uncertainty is the gadfly of the mind. Right. I love that. I love that phrase. Right. Because that sort of means that you can have, even if there's no one else around to question what you're thinking, you can sort of internalize that and have a little gadfly on your shoulder, kind of, probing you and saying, hey, does this really make sense? Is this really what you're going to conclude? I mean, how do we cultivate that?
Well, it fits back into that idea of good stress. I mean, being willing to not sit with, I don't really love that term either, but being willing to know that the good stress of uncertainty is not a defeat, that helps you lean into uncertainty and not retreat from it. I mean, one way we can, cultivate a stance that allows us to then practice the skills of uncertainty is to not focus too much on outcome. So one of the surest ways to have performance declines in a live situation or even on a long-term project is to focus too much on outcome. This can be fear of failure or can be reward-based distraction. And there's this lovely study out of the Netherlands that shows in high level, as in Wimbledon level tennis tournaments, in the finals, if the trophy is I'll start that again. There's a wonderful Dutch study that's an analysis of high level professional tennis tournaments on the level of Wimbledon that shows if a trophy is shown prominently on the court, displayed on the court during the finals, the champion begins to fail. They begin to lose points, etc. So that's that reward-based distraction. It's really important to make sure that you're not focusing too much on the reward or the punishment at the end of the line so that you can listen to, so you can kind of, lean into that arousal. That's what the good stress is called, of uncertainty. And it's a form of wakefulness. It really, I sort of feel as though it gave me a new lens, new understanding of mindfulness. And one way athletes do this is to use something called cue words. Those are little mantras that they say to themselves during the game to be open, be in the flow, or in the game, Maggie, or focus now. They swivel their attention. So there's a sort of attentional capability here. They swivel their attention back away from outcome. And I have found this to be extraordinarily useful for me. One of the worst, times I ever had. I love public speaking, but I can be pretty nervous about it, as a lot of people can. And I was speaking to a very, I would say shark-infested crowd. And I just got really focused, partly because the organizers had fired the previous speaker in the middle of his speech and had him walk off the stage. So I was a little daunted, intimidated, and I had to rope myself back into the moment. I wish I'd known about uncertainty, but now I feel as though, well, when you're in the moment of uncertainty, when you don't know what will happen, and that's okay, you then become so much more in tune with the nuances and the possibilities. And that's exactly what these stress studies have shown too. People just ace, for different job interviews and things like that, when they can, wield all these capabilities.
Yeah, I think you call it choking on money, but it's similar to this paradox of happiness, right? If you are seeking out happiness, you're less likely to achieve it. If you are seeking out success,
or
in your
even
pursuit
a good night's
of
sleep.
yeah, right.
Exactly.
But and I think you had some great examples from the COVID pandemic of when, for instance, doctors and public health officials stuck to some recipes which were really optimized for previous pandemics, right, or different pandemics. But there, I mean, we were in a situation of high environmental stress. So it seems like when there's high environmental stress for whatever reason, pursuit of rewards or trying to avoid bad outcomes, then you're not comfortable with the epistemic distress of not knowing. So, I mean, is there a relationship there? Is it important for you to be in an environment where you feel safe and comfortable otherwise, so that you can relax into the stress of not knowing?
Well, that's a great point. And of course, perception is always a sort of lovely dance between the human and the environment. And so we have to take that into consideration. One way, perhaps, of talking about this is another important sort of pillar or approach to uncertainty. We've talked about good stress, and then also about the skill that you can utilize in uncertainty as illustrated by adaptive expertise. But another important aspect of this, as I think I alluded to, is our individual differences. So we all sit somewhere on the spectrum of this new personality trait. It was actually discovered about 50 years ago, but it's getting a lot of attention, called tolerance of uncertainty or intolerance of uncertainty. So if you're tolerant of uncertainty highly, you're more a flexible thinker. You like surprises. You see uncertainty as a challenge. Intolerant people during the acute phase of the pandemic, for instance, they were far more likely to turn to denial, avoidance, and substance abuse to cope. So it's really interesting because our intolerance of uncertainty is mutable. Not only can we boost our tolerance, we can practice, we can do daily exercises, there are clinical studies that are actually treating anxiety just by helping people bolster their tolerance of uncertainty. But it's also important to know that it's situational. So everyone, if they are under time pressure or feeling pressured to give an answer, or tired, which is just about all of us every day now, become more intolerant of uncertainty. Another way to put this is a psychological term called need for closure. As one scientist told me, this is a state where you just want an answer, any answer. And of course, as we talked about also, the culture rewards this. And so it's important to know if you're tired or overwhelmed, you'll be far less open to uncertainty. And that's just something to take into consideration. It's going to be a little bit maybe harder to pause or to delve into your uncertainty, to look at those options. But again, that's exactly when you need to do that. Most of the time, the first thought that comes to our mind is based on what we already know, because that's what heuristic intuition is. That's what intuition is. So the first gut response you have to almost everything is based on what you already know. If you want to work at the edge and really understand what's going wrong, what's going on now, and how I can best adapt a solution to this problem, you really need to get beyond what you know. And that's true of creativity too.
Yeah, and I think you notice also that there's a correlation between comfort with uncertainty and the ability to engage in self-control, right? And I think you dig into the research around precarity, right? And so if you are raised in an environment of precarity, then you're going to probably wind up on a different point on the spectrum. And it's adaptive, right? I mean, it's adaptive for that environment. It becomes maladaptive if you then try to survive in a different environment, the environment where, things are more settled. And so what's the research look like there? I mean, I love this research because most people think in terms of, good and bad. So if you go back to the Michelle marshmallow experiment, it's like, well, look, these people are defective. It's like, well, no, they're just adapted to perhaps a different environment and climate, right?
Right, exactly. To put it very reductively or simplistically, a lot of the work on child development and raising children in the best way possible and success at school, et cetera, is based on an assumption that the world is predictable and the skills we have in a predictable world, i.e., being quick, being routine experts or something, are exactly what we need to teach our children. But actually, it's not the full story, as we've even known from, historic stories, people like Charles Dickens or Jesse Owen or Sonia Sotomayor, who are extraordinarily capable and smart and grew up in these very, very, what, we might call impoverished environments, where, they had to have certain skills that have been ignored. So now a lot of studies show that children who grow up in more unpredictable households, where the childcare and work routines are a lot more chaotic, can actually develop skills, and often develop skills such as being more hyper attuned to their environment, having higher working memory, links to that good stress we were talking about, and being very attuned to even anger in their environment. One study by Noni Gaylord did a longitudinal study of urban Black male teenagers and found that if they showed this kind of hyper arousal, edginess, we might say, they were much less likely to witness violence in their neighborhood over the course of a year. So definitely a survival skill. It's really important because it made me really think. I actually grew up in a very precarious household. I mean, on certain scores, and I really connected with this research and how I see the world. And yet at the same time, I also always thought that the idea of predictability was the holy grail. And now I really think it flipped my worldview. I'm not really exaggerating. It's flipped my worldview to understand that an unpredictable world is what humans throughout evolution have evolved to be capable of navigating. And so why, as many people and researchers say, why are we trying to train or teach kids who are really excellent at dealing with precarity, away from the skills that allow them to survive? And it's also really important to underline that no one wants anyone to be raised in situations where they're uncertain about the roof over their head or uncertain about their next meal. We're just beginning to understand that, we often misconceive what's good and what's bad in these situations, but everyone has a human right to, of course, not live in poverty. But but if people grow up in actually adoption, alcoholism in the family, lower economic situations. These are all situations that are being studied as precarious. If people grow up in those, well, we shouldn't denigrate the actual skills that they do accrue. In fact, I think we should learn to listen from the what people know, and when people know how to. And there's work being done internationally on this score in learning about how nomadic people, pastoralists, and indigenous people learn about and know about uncertainty in ways that we don't.
So, I mean, that literature would suggest that if you take someone who is raised in a non-precarious environment and you shift them to a precarious environment, then they're not gonna thrive, right? Because they're not going to be sensitive to the cues that they need to be sensitive to, right?
Well, it's interesting. One of the studies out of the University of Minnesota, which was really interesting, took kids who were adopted from foreign institutions, which are very difficult situations. And long story short, they were playing a trust game. They thought they were playing against another child. They had to decide whether to give their coins over or to keep them or whatever. They were rewarded for being generous and trusting the other to an extent. This was actually a bot. They were playing with the bot turned on them and became less, kind and generous in return. The kids who'd been adopted learned really quickly when not to trust the other player, whereas children who had grown up in non-precarious situations continue to be giving away their resources far beyond the time when the signals were telling them not to be. That's really being, less attuned to our environment. I mean, I don't want to extrapolate too much, but look around us. And I think so often many of the problems of our day might be, at least to some extent, helped by being more attuned to our environment, more attuned to nuances and possibilities, more attuned to each other, what we're trying to say, rather than just categorizing and making snap judgments about others and the world.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if these dispositions are sticky in both directions, right? So, if we went back to the marshmallow experiment, as far as I know, no one just repeated that numerous times, but it'd be interesting to see if the folks who, waited, if they were deprived of the marshmallow, if they said, you know what, I'm not going to wait anymore, versus the ones who didn't wait and they got to see, oh, look, the other kids are getting double marshmallows. Maybe I can learn to wait. I mean, is it symmetric? Is the learning symmetric on both sides?
There's a little bit of evidence from studies of the marshmallow that kids who are repeatedly promised the reward and do wait, and then have an experience of a broken promise and the reward doesn't appear, by the second or third time they do learn. And so, yes, people can be, kind of less able to be agile in an unpredictable environment. But at the same time, you can also, become more skeptical when it comes to these marshmallows and learn to be more opportunist, basically, which is what, the bird in the hand is the old saying that, illustrates that. So I think it does go both ways.
Because there was another body of literature that you cited in the book, which said something to the effect that, if you have this early experience of precarity, it kind of, sears the neuronal pruning in place, right? And that it makes it more difficult for you to be flexible later in life. I mean, it seems like those two areas of research are in disagreement.
Well, I would say, it's hard to compare because a short-term marshmallow, kind of reward-based study happening in a few minutes to a 4-year-old is different than children who are living for years in precarious situations. So they might be, emerge to be more opportunistic. And I think that, it's and also we're just beginning to learn how those environments shape the brain, and we're just beginning to learn, what might be an upside in certain circumstances and what might not be. So children who are in these precarious situations, for during their childhood, relentlessly so, are more likely to have premature brain maturity, myelination of the brain. The pruning, as you mentioned, occurs earlier and more dramatically. And what that all means is that their brain becomes a little less flexible. So to put a long story short, they're more stuck in threat mode. It's hard to say, where plasticity can be, where we can deter that, where we can add to these skills, where the skills are, become extreme and thus detrimental. It's really hard to say. This research is really new, but it is really important to know that, of course, being, living in uncertain environments, it have great benefits for those environments. At the same time, there are costs. So there are other studies that show that people who are raised in lower income environments often can be, to some extent, some people are highly resilient, high achievers, and they have physiological signs that their bodies are aging because of the stress it takes to operate in these different situations well. So it's a really complex thing, but I think it's very important to understand that uncertainty is complex and it's not the disaster that we feel. I mean, look at the headlines, look at the talk around the kitchen table. Uncertainty is sort of the bad guy, the bogeyman. I listen to, media reports that constantly portray it as just a one-word lamentation of our time. And I think it's time that as we need to do with technology, as we need to do with any great trend, historical era, facet of a historical era, we need to be cognizant and understand the nuances and the complexities of what we're talking about.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about learning and memory and the role of rest and reflection. What I found interesting was you talk about this dialogue between the hippocampus and the cortex, right? Which, leads to kind of optimal forgetting. And it reminded me of what we're doing now in the world of AI, where we set up these agents and tell them to, debate things, right? And we get better outcomes than we would if we didn't have this kind of debate going on. So, I mean, what have we learned there about the importance of both rest, sleep, and reflection?
Yes, I think systems that are set up to debate that's more akin to the dissent work that I was talking about in some ways, to be one's own gadfly. But in terms of memory, it's sort of a story of curation. I was really interested in the fact that pausing goes hand in hand with uncertainty. It's slowing down. There's a temporal quality to uncertainty. It literally does slow us down. And so what does that mean? And it's really interesting that the work which has been really siloed, the work on naps or working on sleep or REM sleep or working on pauses has all been very much distinct or separated. But I think people are putting it together. And what we find is what I call fallow time is extremely good. Fallow time, which is not having an answer, is extremely good for memory, not just for classic learning vocabulary lists, but basically for this incredible, kind of art that our mind does to curate and to sift and digest information. I mean, it's really fascinating. I went and spent the night in a sleep lab in Boston, run by Robert Stickgold, a world-renowned researcher on sleep. And I saw his colleague trying to kind of plant dreams into this young college student, play a video game, and then what are you thinking of as you fall asleep? And she was sort of thinking about, her high school hallways, and she was thinking about, a time when she was at home trying to peep through a hallway to watch basically, her mind had begun to already curate and transform the memory of this labyrinthian maze-based video game. What happens is not that our mind just it takes a snapshot of whatever it is we learn or experience during the day. The mind digests and curates and sifts and sorts. So this happens in two ways. One, through replay. The hippocampus replays literally what we experienced during the day. A mouse who learned a maze game, learning to find food in a maze, will replay at high speeds the exact route that gets to the food. But at the same time, replay is always going to be a little bit different. It's not like a cut and paste Xerox. What happens then is that the hippocampus begins to communicate with the cerebral cortex, the place where the uppermost layer of the brain where we store long-term memory, and begins to, kind of in this crosstalk between these parts of the brain, begins to kind of lay down memories in a sort of branching knowledge tree-like way. So again, the mind is not a computer. The mind is not memory is not a file folder, et cetera. And what's really important here, I think, is that what we learn that just corroborates what is not new is easy to assimilate. You can learn that quickly, although resting and pausing and sleeping help drive this system. So they're absolutely important for this system of memory. But what is contradictory to what we know, what's really radically new, what shifts us in a way, takes weeks or days, and it takes time. So this is one of the most important parts when we abstract and generalize and realize that this certain kind of experience is not something we want to keep going on, or if we date this kind of person, it's really not going to end well. We finally learn this lesson. It takes time. It's contradictory, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful if pausing more in our lives actually helped us to become more tolerant and engage with, our political opposites? Maybe the hurried, maybe there's a direct or dotted line even between the intolerance and hate and divisions of our day and our propensity to speed through them.
Well, look, if I come back in my next life, I want to be a journalist, because then you get to go and visit all of these labs, surgical rooms, and so forth, right? That sounds like a lot of fun. But, I work a lot with executives, and it's common now for people to, get advice. Set aside some do-nothing time, right? Set aside some reflection time, right? But the executives I talk to, they say, well, good luck with that. Like, when am I going to do that? And I think you describe a story where this one surgeon tried to do this in his research lab, and no one would do it. Right? I mean,
he's actually a synthetic biologist, one of the world's greats, a Rhodes Scholar, MacArthur Fellow, Jim Collins in Boston. And it would take all the rest of the show to list his achievements. And he schedules creative time. This would be more for daydreaming, kind of thought experiments. But again, it's a pause in his busy schedule. It's to all of society, it looks like he's doing nothing. He sits and thinks, which many, many people have told me who work in workplaces that they wouldn't be caught dead, being seen thinking, and which is literally letting your mind, move through left to its own devices. He tried to get his young stable of really brilliant scientists and engineers to do this on Fridays just for a little while, not just to kind of get people speaking to each other and off their computers, but also to get them to daydream. And they just couldn't understand how, even though they realized that they should take him seriously. He attributes his great success to these incredible times when his mind is able to, leap forward and explore those knowledge networks that you lay down when you're pausing in fallow time is literally doing nothing. If you're trying to learn something new and you turn to a video game quickly, you will learn 20% less of that material than if you just pause for a short period of time. But the pausing is not the same as daydreaming. The pausing in order to learn, the fallow time, is really doing nothing. People who even just run through the material, even though they're doing nothing, are actually not going to get as much boost. You really have to do nothing. Whereas creative daydreaming is, again, it's a temporal pause in what we consider successful in our lives. But that's allowing your mind to drift a certain course. You don't want to be hijacked by what you're going to have for lunch, but at the same time, I call it controlled drift. And that's what creative daydreaming really is. Ultimately, I tracked down one of the most brilliant of his proteges 5 years later, and he really was learning to daydream and began to see the light. He had changed his mind, but it just shows you how difficult it is to do in our society.
Yeah, I wonder if the reason why we need to time block daydreaming time is because all of those little moments where we did this, perhaps, I'm guessing you might be old enough to remember back when you would wait for the bus or, walk to the mailbox, and you would have moments spread throughout the day where you could mind wander, right? And now those times are filled with distraction. And to circle back to your book on distraction, is the continual presence of this stimulation, is this not only suppressing our capacity for mind wandering, but is it also kind of, turbocharging this environmental stress? It's simulating an environment of continuous stimulation and precarity that interferes with the kind of curiosity that is necessary.
Yes, I think it does. And, there are scientists who are truly worried about the amount of external, stimulation that's thrust upon kids. And as they are needing to learn to develop an internal life, a life where maybe they consciously try to sit with a problem and, use that kind of adaptive expertise of inhabiting the question, or an internal life where they allow their mind to digest experience and, do so in ways that we can't be conscious of. The daydreaming is really, really related to mental well-being. And that means, and these networks of the brain that are responsible for internal coherence of a daydream and even for just daydreaming itself in the imagination itself and self-awareness, this, default mode network and executive networks, are toggling on and off with networks related to external attention. That's why when we're daydreaming, we feel what scientists call decoupled. You're daydreaming, you miss what the boss says, you're kind of emerge from it like a swimmer bursting out from the water. You really are perceptually decoupled. So this is another way in which uncertainty is really, kind of a beautiful aspect of our life. You might be highly attuned to your environment, and that's, really important for navigating uncertainty. But you also might be decoupled from your environment and be in an uncertain situation, letting your mind have a little bit more control. And I have no doubt that I really agree that it is a grave danger for us to always be the subject, the object of constant media, because, we can go into long technological discussions, but I call technology the template of another's thoughts. You're basically inside somebody else's bullet point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess last question. I mean, it seems like there's a meta skill that is where you have control over your attention, and you can decide whether to orient it inwards or outwards, and you can slow down and speed up your thinking, right? And you can intentionally reflect, right? And I mean, is this a I don't know, a skill that we should be training explicitly in, say, our students? I mean, I try to teach it almost obliquely, right? Through the teaching of other material. It's sort of the process of my teaching. But I mean, should we be kind of surfacing this and like we used to have physical education in school. I don't think we even have that anymore, but should we have sort of, I don't know, mental education so that people learn how to learn how to focus, learn how to daydream, learn how to manage attention and memory?
Well, yes. And I think that ideally, in an ideal world, we would weave these skills in and out, in and around, and make them a part of every, bit of education, for children who are even 4 years old to understand that there are 3 networks of attention. That, we kind of willy-nilly use these words focus, and we don't really understand how that distinguishes from awareness, and then what it feels like to be focused or be aware or to manage your attention. These are lessons that we do need to teach kids, and I don't think it should be sort of siloed into, just as library science has now become just, how to pluck away at the internet, and not really, anything more. So I think that it's really important. And I think that similarly with uncertainty, there are ways to be skillfully uncertain. It is a part of human flourishing. The links between being tolerant of uncertainty and well-being, people who are intolerant of uncertainty, the rigid thinkers, are far more vulnerable to anxiety. And it's just important for us as humans who can thrive, who can think well, who can be attuned to the world. I mean, we're just talking about the upper reaches of what a human is and all that we can do when we admit or embrace the fact that life is challenging and frustrating and slows us down, and we are not machines, and we're not Xerox machines. We're not deficient versions of AI. We're something, not to get too corny, but we're something else. And we need to recapture what that is and not think of it as outdated.
Well, Maggie, thanks so much for joining me. This new book is called Uncertain, The Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure. Thanks so much.
Thank you for a great conversation.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.